Before we think about the flow to our lesson or what strategies we are going to use, we have to determine the academic language demand that students will need to be successful with the objectives that we want them to reach. When we think about this, we want to think about both the language and the content students must have access to, as well as the language that they need to show their understanding. It's both the receptive and the expressive pieces that we need to look at. So our objectives today are to apply the knowledge that we have of language proficiency levels and WIDA tools to understand how to backwards plan for academic language demand of a learning task. This is the process for determining academic language demand. Pause the screencast now and just take a moment to refamiliarize yourself with the steps of the process. When we get started, we first need to determine our content objective. To get the content objective, we always want to think about our standards first. In a few moments, we're going to be reading this text together called Freedom Summer. As the teachers who planned this lesson began to think about the content that students would need to be able to do to understand this text, they referenced their standards. They really focused on this first standard here. Refer to the details and examples in a text when explaining what the text says explicitly and when drawing inferences from the text. Once we take a look at our standard, we can think about essential questions as well as the content objectives to help our students meet that standard. So in this case, the teachers decided that they would ask the questions, what do you think young Joe learned in Freedom Summer, and what events in the text led him to learn what he did? You can see with these two questions that students will both be making inferences and using details or text evidence to do so. Then from this thinking, they constructed a content objective. I can make inferences about how characters change and use evidence from the text to support my thinking. We always start with our content objective first so that later at the very end of the process, we can combine our content objective with our language objective. Keep this content objective in mind as we move on to this next piece. In just a moment, you are going to pause the screencast and actually read the text Freedom Summer for yourself. If you would like to, you can first read and just get the overall gist of the text. Then, when you reread with the lesson outcome and the questions in mind as if you were a student, and then be ready to jot some of your ideas down. Pause the screencast, read the text at least once, and think about the lesson outcome and questions and how you would answer that. Once you have read, unpause the screencast. So we've just gone through the first part of this process, the content objective. The next part of the process is to think of a strong sample response to that lesson outcome. When we write our strong sample responses, we do not write them as sentence frames first, but as a whole proficient example. This is extremely critical because it helps us make sure that we are hitting the benchmark for the standard and the objective itself. It also helps us make sure we're not missing something or using inauthentic language. So we're going to just dive right in and do this. So thinking about what you read in these questions, what do you think young Joe learned? What events in the text led him to learn what he did? I want you to pause right now and on just a piece of paper that you have, you won't need to turn this in, write out the answer you would give to this question. Think about 4th grade as we used 4th grade standards, and think about what would be proficient for a 4th grader. When you are writing your bridging, reaching response or your native-like response, you're thinking about what would meet the grade level standard. Take a minute and pause to do this for yourself. When you have done this, unpause the screencast and we will move to the next piece. Welcome back. You can see where this response would be written in your lesson plan. It's going to be on the left side of the T-chart that says responses and sentence frames. Remember, before writing any frames, we're going to get to that part in a minute, we want to make sure that we always have our full response. This helps us be authentic with our language. Here's an example of what the teachers who worked on this lesson came up with as a proficient response to these questions and to the content objective. Take a minute and pause the screencast so you can read this reaching response. Once you have written your most proficient response, before differentiating any of your responses, you want to pause to really think about what are the key language functions. Typically, there is one or two that students need to be successful with the response. Remember that language functions are the purposes for what we're doing. Along the left side here, you will see some of the most common functions that show up in academic coursework. Cause and effect, compare and contrast, describe, explain, proposition and support, and sequencing or retell. Functions help give predictable language for the different pieces. Let's take the function of compare and contrast for a second. What specific language will let someone know that you are communicating for the purpose of comparing and contrast? You can see some of the ideas in the yellow box below. You should notice that no matter what content we are in, this predictable language or functional language for compare and contrast helps us know that that's what our bigger purpose is. You might play around right now and pause the screencast with trying the first two frames or those first two functional language pieces. Maybe compare two shapes in math, try the language. Now compare two characters in a text. Notice how the language is broad enough that it can be used with different contents or context, but it's specific enough to still help us know that we are comparing and contrasting. There are some really helpful tools that are linked in your to-do list. Take a minute right now and open those and put them up alongside so that you can use this tool to support you as we think about what some of the functions in the Freedom Summer text might be. Along here on the right side are also a few extra functions that may show up in academic work. Summarize. An important note about summarizing is that there will always be a secondary function. Typically there'll be summary language and another important function underneath of it. It could be describe, it could be sequence. It depends on the context. Predict, infer, and generalize is another important one. Proposition and support. Sometimes in elementary this is seen as make an inference and cite evidence. And then we also have question and conjecture in math and oftentimes science. So let's go back to our sample reaching response. Go ahead and take a minute and read it again. Look at the function tools that you pulled up from the online resource. Now, think about what do you think is the most dominant function or functions of the Freedom Summer text. Pause the screencast while you do this thinking work. Welcome back. So looking at this response, it really helps us be able to see that we have two dominant functions here. One would be proposition and support, and another would be cause and effect. As you look at the sample, see some of the language that might help you come to that conclusion. What matches up with the resources that you looked at from online? The other important reason we write a whole response out versus writing in sentence frames is that it really helps us understand what the function of language is. Sometimes we might guess, but until we authentically write it out, we don't always know. Oftentimes people find it surprising that cause and effect is a key function needed for this task, although there are some clues in the essential question. For example, what events in the text led him to learn what he did. But sometimes we might think that the key function here is infer. It sort of is in that sense of proposition and support, but we also need to recognize that there is this cause and effect. It's a really important piece, and we want to make sure we understand that first as teachers so that we can be able to give students the language they need to be successful with that as well. Once you've determined your main function, your function is going to be the same for all of the language proficiency levels that you differentiate for. At this point, what we want to be able to do is differentiate our responses now to meet the language needs of students at varying proficiency levels. We are going to use the real performance definition to help us develop responses at the different proficiency levels. So remember, at this point, you already have a response for bridging and reaching. We always want to start with the highest level. Then from there, we're going to differentiate for a level 3-4 and then a level 1-2. When you start to differentiate, you really want to take a look at the WIDA performance definitions and what students can do at the different levels. A little cheat idea for this is the sentence level is a really good place to start, or any of the descriptors that talk about what sentences sound like. Remember that at a level 3, a hallmark of that is students use expanded and compound sentences. Remember that compound sentences are two independent clauses joined by a conjunction. Students at the entering and beginning level, according to the performance definitions, use phrases or short, simple sentences. You are going to want to keep this in mind as you change your responses. One last piece of advice here before you get started thinking about this. The other thing we want to make sure of is that we do not change the learning outcome for our earlier levels of English proficiency. The outcome needs to stay the same. The students need to make inferences from the text, and they need to be able to use text evidence to support those inferences. So please don't forget that as you are differentiating your responses. Something that you'll notice here with the reaching response before you go on is that we do have behaviors of language in this response already. Take a look a second at the performance definitions. You'll want to look at speaking and writing. They are linked in the online resources. You'll notice that at a sentence level, students at level 4 and 5 use a variety of sentence lengths. They use complex sentences and compound sentences. So something to think about with that is take a look at this response. Notice where you see some of those more complex sentences. Remember, complex sentences are when there is a dependent clause. Here's an example. He was able to learn this when he found out that the townspeople would rather close the pool than allow black people to swim there. Here's another one. Even though there were strong prejudices in town, that's your dependent clause, he showed courage, that's independent, and here's another dependent, when he went into the store with John Henry. These are complex sentences, and this is something that is a hallmark of the higher levels of language proficiency. As you are differentiating your responses, you're going to want to think about how can you turn these complex sentences into compound sentences and expanded sentences for a level 3 and 4, and then into simple sentences for a level 1 and 2. Here's an example of a developing response. Take a moment and read it. You can pause the screencast. Notice how the students are still meeting the lesson outcome. However, you can see how the language is more appropriate for the proficiency level. Do you see some compound sentences? Here's one. The townspeople closed the pool because they were prejudiced. The townspeople closed the pool, that's an independent clause. They were prejudiced, that's another independent clause. These two independent clauses are joined with the conjunction because. Now take a moment and think through how you might differentiate for a level 1-2. Remember, we're going to want to use simple sentences and or phrases. Here's an idea of what this might look like. The student might be able to give you a simple sentence, like Joe learned to be a good friend. However, this in itself is not enough because they did not give the text evidence to back this up. At this point, the teacher is just fine to prompt. When did he learn that? Then the student can answer again in a simple sentence. This is a little tip when you are differentiating for level 1 and 2. Oftentimes you may have to split up the response with a teacher prompt in between to ensure that students get all of the outcome that you want all of your kiddos reaching. All right, so now that we've gone through the first 3 parts of the process, we've determined our objective, we have strong sample responses, not only at the highest proficiency level, but at least the